Basketball was originated in America in 1891 and has taken tremendous strides.
This is where it all began. Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, Canada. The New York Knickerbockers and the Toronto Huskies meet in the inaugural game as a new league is born. A league that will grow by leaps and rebounds. A league that will increase in stature and reach enormous proportions in the 25 years that follow. The league had its first dynasty. The Minneapolis Lakers dominated play in the late 40s and early 50s, winning 5 championships in 6 years.
Bob Cousy. Although small by pro standards, Bob is one of the all-time basketball greats.
Cousy would electrify the league with his flair and showmanship.
One man changed the face of professional basketball in the decade of the 50s and through the decade of the 60s. His name is Bill Russell. It is no coincidence.
The NBA has been around for almost a century, and the sport of basketball has been around for even longer than that. Throughout this wide time frame, we've seen the game go through countless changes. I believe from the day the NBA was founded to the current day, there have been 6 unique eras of the game. These 6 eras capture the different changes of players, teams, play styles, strategies, and culture. The era we're going to cover today is what I like to call the Genesis, which spans from the years 1946 to 1959. And I think based off that name, you have a pretty good idea of what happened during this time. This was the very beginning for the league. The game would almost be unrecognizable if you saw it live today. To start us off, the NBA as we know it wasn't even the most popular league of basketball at the time. College basketball was still the preferred way to watch high-level basketball. The NCAA tournament featured iconic teams like University of Kentucky, University of Kansas, and the University of San Francisco, who produced memorable moments and outstanding players. But we're going to be focusing on the NBA in this video. In 1946, the BAA, or the Basketball Association of America, was founded. It was June 1946 in New York City when Boston Garden owner Walter Brown realized that major ice hockey arenas, which were empty most nights, could be used to host basketball games. Eventually, in 1949, the BAA and the National Basketball League, better known as the NBL, combined to be one league, calling themselves the National Basketball Association, better known as the NBA. The game was completely different in these developing years. During the late 40s and early 50s, the average field goal percentage was in the high 20s and low 30s. Mind you, the average field goal in today's game is about 48%. That's making almost half the amount of shots that you would make today. This obviously means that the scores of games were a lot lower. The average points per game for a single team in the 40s was in the high 70s and low 80s. To combat this problem, in the 1950s, we saw the introduction of several rule changes that aimed to increase the overall speed and excitement of the game. The most significant rule was the introduction of the 24-second shot clock in 1954, which revolutionized the game by adding a time limit for teams to attempt a shot. This change increased the pace of play and encouraged teams to play more aggressively and adopt fast-paced strategies. Some other rule changes that dramatically improved the quality of the NBA was the elimination of offensive goaltending, which was implemented in 1956. Mind you, defensive goaltending was already illegal. In 1951, the league introduced a team foul limit, which was initially set at 6 fouls per team in each quarter. This was implemented to limit excessive physical play and to protect the league's players. In the early 50s, we saw the addition of the restricted area under the basket, which prevented players from taking a charge right under the basket. We also saw the addition of the 3-second rule later in the 50s. This prevented players from camping in the paint for an excessive time. It also encouraged ball movement and spacing, while also giving smaller players a more fair chance. Another event that was added to help the entertainment of the game was the All-Star Game, which was first held in 1951, creating an exciting and flashy game with all the league's best superstars. We also saw the first instances of live televised coverage of the NBA, which was still relatively limited compared to down the road, but it helped the league expand and helped basketball as a sport expand. Another revolutionary thing we saw in the NBA that was bigger than just basketball was racial integration. The 1950s marked a significant step towards racial integration in not just professional basketball, but professional sports in general. In 1950, Earl Lloyd became the first African American to play in an NBA game. This paved the way for a way more diverse representation in the league and in the sport in general, leading to the integration of teams and eventually transformation of the NBA into a diverse and inclusive league. These rules, changes, and additions, while they seem ordinary and routine in today's game, were revolutionary for the game's development at the time. Now, you can't talk about the infancy of the league without talking about the game's earliest superstars. The very first superstar of the league was Joe Fulks. Now, you see, Joe was quite the offensive threat back in the day. He led the league in scoring in both 1947 and 48, putting up 23 and 22 points a game both those seasons. His highest scoring season was 26 points a game in 1949, but that was overshadowed by the physically imposing threat George Mikan, who averaged 28.3 points a game that season. George Mikan is universally known as the very first GOAT of the NBA. Mikan was quite the player. In his heyday, he was averaging about 28 points and 14 rebounds. Insane for that time. For his time, George Mikan was a very efficient scorer, shooting a career 40% from the field. Mind you, this was about 10% higher than the average. He led his Minneapolis Lakers to 5 championships in 1949, 50, 52, 53, and 54. The Mikan-led Lakers were the first dynasty the NBA ever saw. During the later 50s, the game really started to progress. In the later 50s, because of the 24-second shot clock, we saw the pace of play skyrocket. The pace shot up to about 100, 110, even 120 possessions per game, when it was at the low 90s just a few seasons prior. For context, the average possessions per game in today's league is about 100. But this wasn't the only thing we saw in the late 50s. We saw some iconic superstars develop in this era. Bob Cousy of the Boston Celtics had some of his best years in the later 50s. He was the first truly great guard we ever saw in the league. Cousy, while only being 6'1", still dominated the floor. He put up about 20 points and 7 assists on any given night in his prime. He was a 13-time All-Star and won the MVP in 1957. Bob Pettit of the St. Louis Hawks also had the meat of his career in the late 50s. Bob Pettit was a strong and imposing big man that could rebound, defend, and score, not only from the paint, but also he had a nice jump shot. Bob Pettit won the league's first MVP in 1956, and he won it again in 1959. Elgin Baylor of the Lakers was drafted in 1958 and was already a great player in the late 50s, but the majority of his career was in the 60s and 70s. Of course, we had to save the best for last. Of course, being Bill Russell. Bill Russell was drafted in 1956 to the Boston Celtics, and he completely changed this franchise. Bill Russell was also a physical and imposing big man, but instead of Pettit, where his game was mostly offense, Russell's game was more defense and rebounding. Bill Russell led the league in rebounding in his first 3 years in the league, averaging north of 20 boards a game during the late 50s. Russell, along with other superstars like Bob Cousy and Bill Sharman, led the Celtics in the 50s to 2 championships and many more in the following years. I believe this is the most important thing we saw in this era of the game. The late 50s was a time where we saw the Bill Russell Boston Celtics, the greatest dynasty we've ever seen in the NBA, begin its road of dominance. I would also argue that Bill Russell was the second GOAT of the NBA. Mikan passed on the torch from himself to Russell to lead the way for the next era. If you want to see how Bill Russell and other Goliaths of the game, like Wilt Chamberlain and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, battled against each other, creating some of the greatest and most entertaining rivalries we've ever seen, I would highly recommend you go and watch the next video.